allow me to I'm pressing record, and then rules, you can also begin live streaming.
Good evening to one and all present. Am I audible? Good evening to one and all present here. Today I, on behalf of the Women's Studies Center, Jesus and Mary College, would like to welcome you all for the fourth session of the webinar series titled Towards 75 Years of Freedom, Contemplations and Reflection on the Women's Question. Our topic for today's session is Political is Personal, Women's Leadership in Trade Unions in India. I would now like to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Samita Sen. She is a noted historian and academician who has previously taught at the University of Calcutta and Jadavpur University and is the Vere Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History at the University of Cambridge since 2018. She was the first Vice Chancellor of Diamond Harbour Women's University from 2013 to 2015. Her doctoral thesis was titled Women Workers in the Bengal Jute Industry 1890 to 1940, Migration, Motherhood and Militancy. I would request the members to kindly keep themselves on mute during the course of the session to avoid any disturbances and post your comments or questions in the chat box. Now I would request Professor Samita Sen to kindly take over and enlighten us with her knowledge.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and congratulating you on organizing the seminar series to mark the 75th year of India's independence. What I'll speak about today is drawn from an article that has come out very recently in the Journal of South Asian Studies, which is titled Gender and the Politics of Class, Women in Trade Unions in Bengal. So if anybody wants to follow this up, they can look up the article. Though some of the things I will say is probably not included in that article, but there is a lot more that is there which I cannot say today because time is limited. So where I take off from is a very significant but relatively dated debate in labor studies and labor history internationally, which is called the outsider debate. The debate was regarding the significance of leadership of labor movements, particularly in the context of trade unions, of people who were not members of the laboring groups that were being organized. And typically, this leadership came from ideologically committed middle-class people who were giving leadership to working class movements. And the fact that these people came from classes or groups whose class interest was antagonistic to the interest of the working class, more aligned to the capitalist against whom the working class was struggling or fighting, that posed interesting social and intellectual questions. So the role of ideology, the differences within, variations within the middle class, all these issues came into that debate. That debate raged on both sides for a while. And then as trade union, interest in trade unions and the faith in the political role of trade unions began to wane, interest in such debates also began to wane. What has not been part of those earlier debates is the question of gender. And it is very remarkable that in the Indian context, we have the presence of very powerful trade union leaders who were women. And what I found interesting in that context is to connect their trade union, these women's trade union leadership, with other political activities they undertook. And along with that, the experiments or transgressions that they undertook in their personal lives. And how do we connect an unusual political activity and commitment with extraordinary decisions that they took in their personal lives? Can we connect them? Should they be connected? That is the question. So I am reversing the feminist adage here. The personal is political is the slogan of the second feminist movement. And I'm asking the question in the reverse. Those who are known, I mean, it's reverse is, it's a chicken and egg kind of causation. It is just that they are known for their trade union participation. They're known as trade union leaders. We have not asked questions about their personal lives and the political decisions they took in their personal lives. So in a sense, that is the way I am framing the question. It's important to keep in mind that these women leader figures that I will be speaking about today were not only trade unionists. Many of them were participants in many political movements of their time. Crucially for us, many of them were also participants in the women's movements of their times. And of course, most of them were also in one way or the other participating in the nationalist movement in the colonial period and in the immediate post-colonial period in what can be loosely called nation building. So this is the framework within which this paper is structured. We are looking at late colonial and immediate post-colonial period. So roughly 1920s to 1970s is the period we are looking at. Quite remarkably, I think this is the headline of the paper. The women leaders were not necessarily organizing women workers. They were trade union leaders. The bulk of the workers with whom they dealt were men workers. There was no gendered leadership. This is not, I mean, the trope of the leadership is gendered, but they're not women leaders of women workers. They are women leaders, but they're leaders of all workers. Also, it has to be kept in mind that this is a process. It doesn't happen in one day. It begins in a small way in the 1920s. The first women leaders, I mean, the trade union movement itself begins roughly in the 1920s, though we have a prehistory of the trade union movement in the late 19th century in Bombay and in Bengal. But the properly so-called trade union movement, self-consciously calling itself a trade union movement, that really is from the early 20th century. 1920s is conventionally the decade. And it is from that very early period of the inception of the trade union movement that we begin to see one or two women playing very important roles. The first that we know, a person who really took a kind of accepted leadership role was Santosh Kumari Devi of jute workers in Bengal, in north of Calcutta. And she very quickly became quite an important leader in the area where she worked. And she was followed by another leader who worked both for scavengers and among jute mill workers, and that was Prabhavati Dasgupta. So I will come to the names a little later in more detail. But the process that I'm talking about begins in a small way in the 1920s. The peak of it is in the 40s, perhaps spilling over a little in the 50s. But it starts waning from the 60s. By 1970, we see a reverse process. We see women leaving trade unions. We see a decline in women's presence and leadership in trade unions. So this starts with the inception of the trade union movement. But as trade union movements become more powerful, as trade unions become more powerful, as they settle into and become more institutionally settled, there is an exclusion of women. And this exclusion, very notably, I'll come back to that point when I'm wrapping up, that this exclusion was coterminous, convergent with another kind of exclusion, and that is the exclusion of women workers from the formal sector, the sector which trade union represented. So there was, though women leaders were not women leaders of women workers, when the exclusion happened, the exclusion included both leaders and workers. And I think this is an important point to keep in mind. The third is that the trope, so why political is personal? Why am I so keen to connect the political and the personal? That is because from that early period in the 1920s, when you see the emergence of women leaders, the trope, the most dominant trope that is used is maternalism. That is to say, people like Santosh Kumari Devi and Prabhavati Devi were called Ma, Maiji, Mataji, by Mairam, by the workers. So they used this trope of motherhood to transcend differences of culture, language, class, gender, and position themselves as bountiful mothers in a kind of social work paradigm. Though Prabhavati was more ideologically left, Santosh Kumari was not. And both of them, so what we are getting then is a extension of conventional kinship language. So that makes it even more interesting that we have at the same time a political language which draws on conventional language of kinship, along with a transgressive personal family practice. And this really is what made these figures so fascinating to work with. Many of the women that we see in the trade union movement in this late colonial and early independence period, and this has been noted of women political activists not only in trade unions but in other radical politics, particularly in terrorist what we call revolutionary movements of the time. This has been first noted by Geraldine Forbes in the 1970s. Tonika Sharkar has written a little bit. Many other people have written on it. Very recently, specific context of left women, we have Anya Lumba's book. And this has drawn attention to this connection between between politics and the personal. And what I'm doing is to extend this kind of connection in some ways to look at how certain kinds of languages in their political practice was at odds with the language they used for their personal domain. Um, Many of these women made unusual family and marital choices. And they also made connections between public and private domains. Because in that time, even though they were using conventional idioms such as motherhood, some of them were behenjis, so sister, um, familial kinship terminology, though they were using those. The very fact that these middle class women in that time were in a space like trade union movement, that itself was radical. And that has to be kept in mind. So many of these women, in fact, were severely attacked in their own communities. So, for instance, both these women I've already mentioned, Santosh Kumari and Prabhavati, were attacked in the media. They were, attacked in their own social circles, and it wasn't an easy choice to make to come into the trade union movement. At the same time, the very fact that they were there, that they were able to come, which they weren't able to come after the 1970s, um, shows you that there was a hospitable crowd. Doors were still open for women to come into trade union politics. So there is then a tension in this, and it has been argued. People have begun to see in new research how, in fact, in left parties, in the 40s and 50s, when the state was, so attacked left parties, many of the leaders had to go underground. At that time, a particular hospitable space had been created for women to take on new public roles within parties, within mass fronts such as trade unions. So there was a particular logic of the time. There was a particular structure of the movement which allowed women to take these unconventional roles. And I would argue that it is in taking these unconventional roles in radical politics, which was relatively difficult for them to do. It allowed them to experiment with transgressive personal relations. So the radical politics and their radical personal choices were not unconnected. Along with this, the fifth thing that I would ask you to keep in mind, though we are not able to cover much of this in this talk, but we could discuss this a little at the Q&A if anybody wishes, is that this is a period, 20s to 70s, which is also a period of women workers' militancy. And though we don't have a lot of names, we don't know a lot of, they don't come up to leadership sufficiently for historical recognition. There is a lot of evidence which shows that women were extremely militant participants in working class struggles in this period. They were certainly not passive recipients, even though there was a great deal of policy pushback in terms of women's participation in the formal sector. So the marginalization of women workers in big industries like, say, cotton in Bombay or jute in Calcutta, that produced a kind of response from women workers, which was not always under the umbrella of the trade union movement. Often that militancy took a form which was outside the discipline of the trade union movement. And that itself is an interesting trend, which we can talk about later. But it also means that there are working class women leaders of trade unions or of working class struggles in the period. And one of the things we have not done, and that I think is a very important research agenda for us, is to recover some of those histories. In Anya Lumba's book, we get mention of two women, Ushabai Dange and Parvati by Bhore, who are more liminal figures. They are not quite of the working class, nor are they part of the middle class kind of leadership. But there are women from the working class, women workers who worked in mills, in factories, who also gave leadership. And it is, we have neglected to write those histories. So, okay, now with that those few introductory remarks, I will trace three trajectories of women leaders. The first trajectory, I would say, is of the early period, the 20s and 30s, where you have these two towering figures, Santosh Kumari and Prabhavati. Both straddled many political movements of their time. Santosh Kumari more than Prabhavati. Santosh Kumari was very active in the nationalist movement, close to the Swaraj Party. She also was very much associated with many activities of the women's movement of her time. Both of them made a transcendental motherhood trope their own. Neither of them were particularly interested in organizing women workers. There was no gender-based agenda that they raised. Prabhavati was the more transgressive in her personal life, but both were attacked, as I said, by middle-class society. Both made highly unusual marital choices. Santosh Kumari left her marriage. Whether she was formally divorced or not is not clear. Her name was coupled with C.R. Das, but that too one doesn't quite know. Prabhavati studied abroad. She had a PhD in those days. Her first movement in trade union movement was with the scavengers movement. She was portrayed in the media at that time as smoking and drinking with the Dhangur scavengers, which was a transgression of gender, caste, class, anything you can imagine. She was very vituperatively attacked. She then, after she did, she led a very major strike in 1928 and then left the movement. She married Bakar Ali Mirza, which was also, the marriage itself was an intercommunity, highly transgressive marriage. And in that sense, both of these women offer us a way of looking at women's trade union activism, because both of them at one point just leave trade unionism. Prabhavati very abruptly. She was the undisputed leader of the 1928 general strike, which was the first major general strike in jute industry, which was the most important industry of that period. It had a huge workforce. And she was the person negotiating after the strike. So she was accepted as the leader. But following disputes about her leadership within the union, she abruptly resigned, she left, and she never returned to the trade union movement. She never returned to left movement at all, or even political activism. So this was a sudden departure. After this, in the 30s, another trade union leader became very significant in leading scavenger strikes in the 1930s. Sakina Begum, who was herself a lawyer and a corporator, again, powerful social figure of her time. She also became like an undisputed, wherever the records I have seen mention that wherever Sakina went, there were 100 scavengers with her. She was, she became a really, really popular leader, and the trade union registers filled up with hundreds and thousands of members when she led the strikes. Then there was they first had a settlement with the corporation. The corporation reneged on that settlement. They had a second follow-up strike. The government arrested Sakina, sent her to Kurseong for as detenue, and the union broke up for that time, but she never returned to politics. See, she just abruptly at that point left the trade union. So this is a trope you see, and many other trade union leaders we will discuss as we go on, abruptly left trade union politics. And this has the few people who have worked on these leaders separately or tried to understand trade union leadership of the time have not been able to explain this. One author who is Manju Chattopadhyay, she did a lot of the interviews of some of these trade union leaders. Santosh Kumari was her discovery. She was still alive, Santosh Kumari, at that time, and Manju Chattopadhyay interviewed her. Her argument explanation is that without the strength of left ideological, communist in particular, communist ideological commitment, these women were not able to sustain trade union work. But that is not entirely true, because this is not, even many communist trade unionists also left abruptly. Prabhavati was in a socialist trade union. So it's very difficult to explain. Some of them leave trade unionism to do other kinds of politics, but some of them don't do that also. They just leave. So if we look at the second rung of people, then we see that many of them are ideologically left, some actually in socialist or communist parties. Some of them become very powerful. Some are not so powerful. They're more sort of mid-rung activists, did not quite rise to leadership positions. So let me mention two of them. One is Maniktala Sen, who we know also because she's left an autobiography. An autobiography she wrote in Bengali, but was later translated in English. So it's available in both Bengali and English. And therefore, she has had some attention from historians. And another person who has had no attention is Shuddhar Roy. Shuddhar Roy belonged to a communist party. She was in the inner group. It was called the Bolshevik group of a splinter, small communist party. She was a very, very committed, ideologically committed activist. And she also worked with dock workers. That was her primary field of work, was dock workers, which again, you can imagine how difficult it must have been for her. She was a school teacher. And so she taught in school during the day. In the evening, she would go and organize workers in the dock. You can imagine how difficult it is today. What it must have been like in the 1930s for her to be able to do this. Very, very committed organizer. Participated in the big dock workers strike in the 1940s. when her fellow communist party members told her, "You can't go. You can't go for this strike because you don't know what will happen. If the police come and all that, you may not be able to leave the area." She insisted she went, and as it happened, one of the days that she went, the police did raid, and it was workers who protected her. She couldn't leave that night, but the workers put her up in one of their houses at night. So there are extraordinary stories like this. And there is also another aspect of this story, which I'm not going to go into any great detail about in the talk, which is that a lot of these women came into this work through other family members. So some, like Santosh Kumari and Prabhavati, we don't know. So though Prabhavati had a brother who was a political activist, Santosh Kumari didn't. She came to it through her political engagement with nationalism. But Shuddhar Roy, for instance, came to politics through her brother, who was also a very committed communist party member. So you have some of these women coming through connections, family connections, but not all. Many of them were the first members of their family to become involved. So you have Maniktala and Shuddha, both of them left trade union politics. So Maniktala was not primarily a trade union organizer. She did organize workers because in those days, if you were a Communist Party member, you had to do some working class organizing. But her primary engagement was with the women's movement. But she abruptly left all of this work. Shuddhar Roy also left this work when the Communist Party split in the 1960s. And neither of them returned to any kind of politics. Shuddhar Roy took up social work. Maniktala just left everything. She retired into her personal life. Two other figures might be interesting to note. One is Beena Das. Beena Das is famous more as a member of a revolutionary outfit and is famous for having shot at Stanley Jackson, was then unsuccessfully shot at Stanley Jackson. Then was arrested and in jail for a long time. She came out, she joined the Congress. She also was very active in multiple industries. She started with rice mills, but then she got involved in printing press, in many other trade unions. And she actually did not quite, she left trade unionism at one point, but she moved into electoral politics. Having left trade unions, she stood for elections, won, was in assembly, and all that. Similarly, Moitrey Bose, she was a dock worker. She was a doctor who gave up medicine in order to do trade unions, also worked with dock workers, and then at some point she was in the Congress. She also, probably because of faction fighting, she also has an autobiography in which the explanation seems to be that she left because of faction fighting, and she also went into electoral politics. So these are the two trajectories we have. One trajectory where people leave, become very powerful, work for a while in trade unions, and then leave and do other things. And another group of people who leave but go into mainstream politics. But the third trope, and this is not really a trope, but one very, very fascinating figure on whom no work, little bits of people have suddenly become interested in her in the last few years. There's been some work. She's called Bhimal Prathibha Devi. And Bhimal Prathibha was virtually unknown 20 years ago, even though she had a very long career in politics. but she had been totally forgotten. And even now we don't know a great deal about her. So I just will finish by saying a few. I can't sort of do a full biography, but I'll try and highlight some aspects of her life, which demonstrates the argument very beautifully. So she started. She came from a family where there was some. Her father had some political engagement, very little, but a conservative Brahmin family. She was married into a conservative Brahmin family. Her husband was a medical doctor. She, soon after her marriage, she would steal out of the house. She didn't tell anybody in the family that she had political activities, so she would leave by the back door quietly and do her political activity without the family knowing what she was doing. Then, after a few years, she managed to convince her husband, who was Dr. Charuchandra Bandyopadhyay, to join her. And they both joined the Congress. She belonged to the Subhash Bose faction. Then, while she was still very much in the Congress, she started negotiating with the Bhagat Singh group, became a member of Naujawan Bharat Sabha. And at that stage began to get involved in other revolutionary outfits in Bengal and became involved in what is called the Maniktala robbery case, which was she took the family's car. She was in the car. They raided a shop for money to buy arms and they got caught. She was let off that time, but then she traveled to an area where soon after she had been there, there was a very famous shootout incident, which is called the Shanti Shuniti case. And she was arrested for being involved in the Shanti Shuniti shooting. And that's the first time she went to jail. And then after that, she went to jail several times because of her association with the revolutionary parties. While she was in jail, she wrote extensively. And I will come to some of that later. After after the last jail sentence, when she came out, she left home. She left her husband. She left her marital home. She did not return. Santosh Kumari, when she left her marital home, she returned to her parental home. Bhimal Prathibha did not go into any home. She started living in the Azad Hind Fauj office. And while she was living in the Bhawanipur office of Azad Hind Fauj, she became interested in RSP, which is the Revolutionary Socialist Party. And through that association, they asked her to go to Raniganj, Asansol area to start organizing mine workers. And that is what she did. She became involved both with mine workers and railway workers. And she became RSP's main trade union organizer in that area. According to hearsay, she lived with another trade union activist called Jo Chaudhary, though they never married. And then died in the 1970s, unmarked, unsung. She's not even a footnote in trade union history, even though for a period she was so powerful in Raniganj Asansol area that nothing could be done in the trade unions at that time without her cooperation. So when she was in jail, she wrote many things, among which are 2 novels. One is called Aguner Phulki, Spark of Fire. Another is called Notun Diner Ado, Light of the New Day. Both of them they are not high-grade literature. but both discuss at great length precisely the question I am posing, which is the relationship between women's family and marital choices and their political ideology. In the first book, the center of the novel are a married couple and they discuss marriage. And the book discusses, the novel, the characters in the novel discuss whether you need to marry, what are the advantages and disadvantages of marriage. In the second book, there is no marriage. Marriage has already been consigned to history. But there is a lot of discussion about couples, of gender roles, of what is comradely love, and issues like that. It is set to avoid. So her first book was banned for a while. So to avoid that, she has set this second novel in Iran, and in the context of People's War. So the whole thing is a dialogue between feminism and communism. It is, I think, it would be wonderful to analyze these novels in much greater depth and detail, which I have not been able to do so far. So in conclusion, I will just say three things very quickly because I'm running out of time. First, that very few of the women leaders that I've talked about, except Maniktala Sen perhaps, none of them they were leaders, they were women leaders of workers, but were not leaders of women workers. They did not raise gender issues about work. They did not, for them, female solidarity was not important. In fact, Maniktala Sen mentions in her autobiography that when she began working with working class women, she was very uncomfortable about the kind of family and marriage practices they followed. And they were sometimes seen as transgressive by middle class leaders. Even though they themselves were also experimenting with personal relationships at that time. Maniktala herself married in, not the conventional endogamy, broke conventional endogamy rules in her own marriage. So the second thing then is that these women found within trade union politics, within radical and left politics, some hospitable grounds for the kind of experimentation with their personal lives they were wanting to do. And why I underline this is the trajectory of marginalization, which kicks in so strongly in the 1970s. Moitrey Bose is perhaps the last of these women to withdraw from trade union politics. After that, in Bengal at least, we don't see very much of women's leadership in trade unions. In Western India, perhaps there is a little more continuity. In the 1980s, we do see a clutch of trade union leaders in Maharashtra, not so much in Bombay, because by then the Bombay cotton industry is in destroy mode already. But in other areas of Maharashtra, we do see women's leadership in trade unions. But really, the reason I chose to speak on this today for this particular occasion is I think this is a very important research agenda. It is 75 years after independence. Many of that generation of women are already gone. This is an opportunity for many of us in wherever we are located in our own regions to find these voices of people who may have been involved in trade unions, may have been involved with working class movements outside trade unions. In the late colonial, there is no chance that people are alive anymore. but in the early post-colonial period. And it is really a great tragedy, I feel, if we don't excavate these voices for posterity. It is one aspect of our own history that speaks so strongly so intersectionality is now so um, we recognize its power so much. And this is a subject which gives us such a strong intersectionality of gender and class. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Samita, for a very, very interesting talk and for introducing us to these women leaders, big ones, and of course, those, as you said, who are working at different levels of movements. I hand over to our student anchors who were able to collect some questions for you. And we also request people to post their new impromptu questions in the chat box, please. Go ahead, Jessica and team.
Yes, ma'am. I'll take forward the questions. Just a second. In the meanwhile, if someone else has a question, they can post their questions. Ma'am, my first question is, how are women's union challenging the status quo of a predominant older male trade union leadership?
Um, do you want me to answer as you ask, or you want me to take questions and then answer?
Ma'am, up to you.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, that is, do women challenge male leadership? Sometimes they do, but not always. So, a lot of the women I spoke about are people who, as I said, are mid rung activists who were able to work with male leadership. But some of these women who became very powerful leaders did challenge male leadership. And in many cases, that is perhaps an explanation of why they had to leave. Prabhavati very clearly clashed with the male leadership of the union, which BPJU, which led the Jute Workers' General Strike in 1928. So, yeah, I mean, they did clash a lot with male leadership, and eventually, that is perhaps the reason why. Um, 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 why you find less and less space for women leaders in trade unions. Certainly, that I would say is true of Bengal. Though we need more regional studies. I mean, what I have said today is based mostly on the Bengal case, which is one of the few well documented cases for the colonial period. We really have documentation for Bombay and Bengal. So we do need much more histories of working class struggles and trade unions in other parts of the country.
Okay, ma'am. How can labor laws address gender issues such as domestic violence?
Come again, sorry, how can labor laws address?
Gender issues such as domestic violence. I've also posted the question in the chat box.
Yeah. Right, okay. This is a very tough question because how can labor laws can address domestic violence, which it has done recently. But whether labor laws can address issues like domestic violence is much more complicated because labor laws tend to address issues in the workplace, not usually spilling out, though the reverse can be true. The and that we have an example of, and that takes us to a very different domain of work, because the Domestic Violence Act in India, the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act, does include one category of workers, domestic workers, for whom, for domestic workers, the home is their workplace. The home of the employer is their workplace. So they come under domestic violence laws. And it's interesting because the fact that home is the workplace connects two laws in the case of domestic workers: domestic violence law and sexual harassment law. So they come under it both as a domestic relationship and as a labor relationship. But in other kinds of work, for other kinds of workers where the workplace and the home is separated, there for labor laws to deal with domestic violence is more complex. We don't have examples of this.
Jessica, may I ask one or two questions in the sequence? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Um, I just wanted to, there were one or two questions coming to mind, Samita. One is Tara Reddy, if you have come across her reference, is, I think, again, a very fantastic figure in the kind of, leadership of women that you mentioned in today's webinar. So I remember when I was working on again, the labor movement in Bombay, they'll actually, along with the seasoned trade union leader, I'd gone to interview Tara Reddy. She's no more. And she was actually, I mean, she was in the women's movement as well. So she was actually a very powerful figure and was part of NFIW, National Federation of Indian Women. But she actually did start a lot of her political work in Bombay's trade union movement amongst, your government workers. And the thing is that she actually, in her personal life, married a worker, and she was from a very wealthy, well-off family, and married a worker from a lower caste. So in terms of all these dimensions, she's again a very important person and a very big leader in the trade union movement of Bombay, 30s and 40s. And given Bombay's otherwise the political fabric in Bombay in terms of the Ambedkarite movement and the communists, and in that, how do you picture a woman leader in trade union movement like Tara Reddy, and her personal life and decision to marry like that? So I thought your comments on that would be, and any other interesting cases that you have come across. And the second question has to do with what you said earlier about these women abruptly leaving the world of formal politics. Now you don't seem to be satisfied with some of the explanations that have been given, like by the people like Manju and other Chotumalia. So what would you say was some of the reasons for these breakages that happened? If you can just elaborate.
Well, the first is, I have not much to say. I mean, that's, in a sense, it would be wonderful if you wrote about that. So we don't, I mean, we know a few of these figures. I've heard of Tara Reddy. I don't know much detail about her life and work. So we need that is my point, that there are probably many women like this in very many different parts of the country. And we need to discuss the very, unusual trajectories some of these women followed, and their lives and work and all that. So yeah, so totally. I mean, I'm with you on that. The second question, Monju Chattopadhyay's explanation, the reason why I'm unhappy with that explanation is because it is also communist women who made that choice, who followed that trajectory. They also left abruptly. So it doesn't seem as though communist ideological commitment is able to sustain these women. So my one explanation would be that trade union follows the logic. So trade union is part of the process of formalization. So when we say, for instance, we use the term organized and unorganized. In another use of those terms, organized would mean organized working class, which means unionized working class, right? So unionization and formalization are coeval processes. The segment of manufacturing industry that became formalized from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s is the same segment which got unionized. So it just as the process of formalization was coeval with masculinization, this is a triad. My argument would be that this is not two things happening together. This is three things happening together: formalization, unionization, and masculinization. And part of this process is the exclusion of women at all rungs. So it begins as the exclusion of women as part of the workforce, which is mapped, which we have, Aryan Dihan has looked at, I have looked at. We have shown how this process is exclusionary of women. It begins by, it's done by legislation in a straightforward way. It first throws out children and then it throws out women. So there is formalization becomes masculinization, and that then impacts unionization. It becomes a male world. If the workforce is all male, then it becomes that much more difficult for women to survive in that environment. And trade union politics also, there is a second issue here, that trade union, because the system of trade unions in India is that trade unions are wings affiliated to political parties. They become part of electoral politics. They become harnessed to the state, which is also a domain of masculinization. So in all this, which is again not wholly sustainable because women are entering electoral politics. But trade unions become more and more masculine spaces. That you can observe.
Thank you for actually pointing out these last 2 points that you said about the masculinization of the factory shop floor, but also trade union politics. I just thought that apart from the electoral politics angle, we also noticed that from the late colonial period 40s, more so in the immediate post-colonial 50s and 60s, there are these debates, on the repercussions of the law, labor law, and how it was nurturing the trade union babu. And this, this bureaucratization, that happens is also, I think, a domain that we need to explore to explain the ouster of a certain rung of, women trade union leaders. So,
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think I would argue that the bureaucratization is part of this process. The formalization and the affiliation to the state, the incorporation in the state, I would even say. So trade union mimics the state. I mean, you can see that. Trade union has a president, a secretary, it has a, executive committee. It mimics the democratic state. It has elections. And the statization, if you like, of the trade union is part of this process. And that is why I was emphasizing at one point that a lot of women's militancy in this period, women workers' militancy, is happening outside trade unions. Because the bureaucratization of trade unions no longer allows the kind of militancy that women are participating in. So there is an interesting story of marginalization here.
So, in terms of, I'll ask one more question, then we'll check the chat box for anything else. But we've seen a kind of a silver lining in the recent years in terms of these very, militant collective action by women workers in the garment sector, coffee, etc. in the last few years. And this is, very often outside the established trade unions or even within the trade union structure. There these, So, how do you interpret this? Because this is now a different conjuncture of capital consolidation, in India. It's not the late colonial context of the 60s, 70s. So, how do you interpret the current trends and an increase of women's membership also in some of the unions?
Yeah, no, this is from, I would say that the trade unions enter a totally different trajectory from the 1990s. I don't think we can compare the previous period to this period. I think very new processes start happening in the 90s. But that is actually should be a whole other discussion. So very briefly, two things I would say. One is that as liberalization progressed, trade union and informalization kicked in, trade unions which were primarily focused on the formal sector began to rapidly face shrinking constituencies, right? So for the first time, then they had to accept that they would have to move in the informal sector. Initial forays of the informal sector mobilization were masculine professions. Very good example is transport sector. Transport sector, wholly masculine workforce was one of the first informal sectors that most big trade unions organized. Then slowly, it is only in the new millennia that they realized that part of this process of informalization required them to address women workers. So it is only in the new millennia that some trade unions, and then once one trade union starts, others follow, many trade unions began to organize women workers, very large workforce, like scheme workers. And for instance, C2's the fact that C2 now has a very large proportion of women members is because of that, because they have organized scheme workers in many parts of the country. So there are particular segments of female-dominated segments which BMS, for instance. BMS has also had a steep rise in the proportion of women members. That is because of domestic workers. They did house-to-house enrollment of domestic workers. So yeah, very recently, you have unions changing their strategy, and they have realized that they can no longer be as far, they command the numbers that they need to do to be relevant to Indian politics if they stick to formal sector. So they are beginning to rethink their mobilizing strategies. What is really interesting for me, ironical, is that while conventional constituencies of trade union, female constituencies, they are rebelling against trade union leadership. And I think the Munnar example is a beautiful example of that. But there are many other examples that women who were part of trade unions are rejecting trade union leadership. And in most cases, these are very male leaderships. And at the same time, in a completely different process, workers who've been left out of processes of trade unions, like domestic workers, they are seeking to enter trade unions. They are actively soliciting conventional trade unions to organize them. So you have these two very contradictory things happening at the same time. And, I'm not sure trade unions have discussed. I've been talking to a few sympathetic trade union leaders to ask if there is discussion about this in their circles. I think that is also something we need to explore much more.
Jessica, do we have any questions in the chat box?
Ma'am, I think there's a question which is a follow up to your comment. Did these women leaders